So something that popped up on my internet this morning was something to do with the 2026 Concorde agreement, a very complex and opaque document that sort of details the obligations commercially that the teams have for whatever time they're in Formula 1 for. They last anywhere between kind of like 5-6 years, but the latest one is supposed to last for just 4 years between 2026 and 2030 because there's all sorts of bits and pieces going on in the background because they want to bring in new rules for 2030. But either way, without this document, Formula 1 wouldn't be in the sort of financial strengthness, it's not a word, is it, that it is today, for better or worse. Something FISA War, something Bernie, something Balestri. You've probably heard this a million times before from me, but it is what it is. The Concorde Agreement was effectively the peace treaty that came out of the FISA War. And while it's not quite as historically significant as the Treaty of Versailles, the Potsdam Agreement, or insert other peace treaty from a war here, it's still an important part of Formula 1 history. Because it meant that the teams were going to get paid, with Formula 1 opening up to a much wider market in terms of the commercial opportunities and the television opportunities too. The salaries the top drivers could command went up, and the amount of money the teams made also shot up, which also increased the budgets. I did a video on this a couple of years ago. I'll probably leave an overlay to a graph I made in that specific video detailing where the budget started going up and down as things changed around the world. But the cost to enter as a privateer back in the 70s were pretty cheap, all things considered. The March chassis was about £9,000, the Ford DFV about £8,000, and the Hewland gearbox was about £4,000. And this was in 1970 and using 1970 figures. So all in, before you've got the rest of the team set up and a driver to actually drive this car, you're looking at the equivalent of about $250,000 in today's money, although add on a tiny bit for the last couple of years of rampant inflation. So by the time the mid-90s rolled around, the figures had gone up exponentially. In 1995, Benetton was raking in the cash so much they could have probably run several seasons with a 1970-era setup. Mild 7, the Japanese cigarette company, was paying around $22 million. Benetton Sports System, $5 million. Bitburger, $4 million. Minor sponsors total around $2 million, and another $2 million for the oil partnership with Elf. Then there was the $8 million for the prize money from 1994, and they were also selling gearboxes to Simtek, which brought in some cash as well. Although Simtek went bust about 5 races into the season, so Benetton didn't make that much money, all things considered. The Concorde Agreement made the lives of the top teams improve, but it made life harder for the smaller teams. The constructors' payouts for the championship only go down to 10th place, so if you finish 11th, you get nothing, in the words of one Willy Wonka. And this actually caused some controversy in the latter part of the 80s or the early 90s, I can't remember which year, when LaRousse was disqualified from 10th place in the standings. They'd made a mistake with the paperwork regarding the car, so 10th place was given to Ligier instead, and Ligier got all the subsidies and everything else that came with that 10th place promotion. Ligier being a team that had connections everywhere within France. The FIA, French organisation. The boss at the time, French. You can see why it looked a little bit suspicious. Fast forward about 10 years or so and you've got the teams like HRT, Virgin and Lotus who were struggling right at the back of the grid because they'd been enticed in with promises that never came. But when one of those teams would finish 10th in the championship and get that last constructors payout position, they celebrated like they just won the thing, because those couple of million that they would have got would have meant the absolute world to them. Teams like Minardi were partially forced out of Formula 1 because of them not having money versus the manufacturers and the bigger teams that wanted to spray money up the walls. The bigger teams basically ganged up on the smaller privateers to force them out in power moves, so that any rules coming in that would go against what they wanted would just end up being rejected by one team because, well, they need a unanimous decision, and one team going against that means that the rule doesn't get brought in. You get rid of that team, and you can make rules no questions asked. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the bigger teams, Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren, and teams that have floated around at that top end for a while, Benetton, Renault, Williams. Because they perpetually finish in the top part of the championship, they get the biggest payouts, meaning that the gulf in spending power at the top remains huge versus those at the bottom. So teams like Simtek, Forte, Pacific, other teams like that, disappeared purely because they just didn't have the funding. And couldn't get the funding, and they got nothing at the end of the season. Now there's spending caps in place, in theory that should bring the teams closer together, but if you end up with one team who has managed to get a new rule set completely right versus everybody else, they've got a massive advantage. See Red Bull a couple of seasons ago and especially last season. In a normal world, so pre-2021, Mercedes, Ferrari and McLaren, they would have just spent their way around the problem, but they can't now, so it's taken longer to catch up. What also happens is that under previous Concorde agreements, the historically significant teams, so Ferrari, Williams and McLaren as well as Red Bull and Mercedes, get an extra little bonus on top of everything else, with Ferrari getting way more than anybody else. A historical payment that is 5% of whatever the prize pot is, which sees them get $100 million even if they finish last in the standings. That payout has been a point of contention amongst fans and the other teams for quite some time. Some are arguing that the thing should be ditched entirely or shrunk down a massive chunk so that some of that 5% can go to giving prize money to an 11th team, especially if that team name rhymes with, I don't know, Banchetti or something. But under the proposed 2026 Concorde agreement, it does look like that Ferrari's Ferrari tax might actually be shrunk down. Because, according to Autosport and other outlets, Liberty Media is approaching the 2026 Concorde agreement much like how the NFL, the American Football League, approaches things. Greg Maffei, I think that's how it's pronounced, the CEO of Liberty Media, wants the teams within Formula One to be closer together for sustained growth and for all the teams to prosper, which may or may not lead to a closer championship, as well as have the sport be bigger as a collective group rather than lots of individuals. The attitude towards it is compete like hell on the Sunday, but then on the Monday, it's all about the league, it's all about the series, and it's all about the teams within that series or league. A far cry from win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Formula One has experienced unprecedented growth in recent years off the back of things like Drive to Survive, the popularity of Hamilton and Verstappen, as well as younger fans, particularly young female fans, being attracted to the likes of Lando and Charles. This has brought more eyes on the sport, although some do think that bubble has started to pop, as audiences are becoming disillusioned with the Red Bull dominance. But things can easily change, especially with 2026 coming up and the new regulations there. And while Bernie would often put the teams up against each other and basically fight to the death over what they want to get within the Concorde agreement, Liberty Media doesn't want to do that. They don't want the whole divide and conquer thing, they want everybody together. But this can have a knock-on effect. The first of these knock-on effects is that the series becomes an old boys club. The new Concorde agreement is set to lock the grid in fully to the 10 so-called franchises that have been talked about before, and if anybody wants to come in, they'll have to buy one, with FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem saying that if Andretti wants in, they've got to buy another team. Some are saying Haas, given the whole situation involving the Stuart Haas NASCAR team in the States right now, but Liberty has also made statements regarding the growth in value of the teams that has shot up in recent years, thanks to the cost caps, Netflix and other things, calling the teams that are at the bottom of the grid in the last 10 years or so, worthless. Manor had been sold for £1 in 2016, and now there isn't a team that's worth less than $1 billion, maybe more, and they raise money at those numbers. We've seen enormous growth in the value of the teams, just as we've seen growth in the value of Formula One. But actually, the teams' values have probably increased more, and that was important. We needed to have a mentality of investment and mentality that these were franchises that could really have true value, and today, that's happened. Maffei then closed all of that with, "We can all profit together," which might get some alarm bells ringing with some fans. We can all profit together. Now, as a football fan outside of Formula One, this does ring some alarm bells with me personally because, well, the Premier League exists. Now, apologies here because, as some of you like telling me in comments, you don't know much about nor do you care for football, and that's fine. There's stuff that you might like that I don't care about, but I do think this is relevant. The Premier League, much like Formula One, has become more valuable than it's ever been. The teams at the top of the league, so your Man Cities, Arsenals, Man Uniteds and Liverpools of the world, have so much pulling power with signing players that spunking 80 million quid on a player is nothing, and then giving that player £300,000 a week. A week! I remember everybody losing their minds when Man United bought Rio Ferdinand for 30 million. Now, because of the obscene amount of money in the Premier League and the worldwide appeal of some of the teams, those teams are now raking in the television money. And what has developed now is a so-called Big Six that have more pulling power, commercial appeal and so on than everybody else. But the Premier League is now looking at hard capping wages under the financial fair play rules that can help reduce that spending ability and give teams like, I don't know, Brighton, Nottingham Forest and even Newcastle, who have just taken on new owners from Saudi Arabia, a way of competing in terms of pulling in players. As you can imagine, the clubs nearer the bottom end of the table, like Nottingham Forest, Wolves, Everton and so on, they're loving this idea. But the big boys, not so much. And you can probably see why. The money contained within the Premier League means that teams in the lower leagues will have to spend massive amounts in the hope they'll reach the promised land of the Premier League, and then the TV money will wipe off whatever they spent in the previous season. But it doesn't always work, and teams in the bottom half of the Championship down towards League 2, where my club Walsall plays, will no longer be able to move beyond where they are because they just can't compete, and it will take things like Hollywood buying Wrexham to allow them to climb up the pyramid. Hi, Editing Aiden here. I just listened to that last part back and I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. The comparison I'm doing is that the Premier League is giving loads of money to teams not just at the top, but teams not good enough to play in that league the following year. So what it's doing is creating an exclusive club of a select amount of clubs. So you have 3 teams relegated, they spend a year in the league below, and then effectively come back because the money they got from being in the Premier League for 12 months means they can effectively just buy their way back in. Formula 1 might end up going the same way, only that nobody can come in, except for the ones who are already there. It's a very exclusive VIP lounge. And it also shows how obscene the amount of money in the Premier League is when Red Bull receives about the same amount of money for winning the World Championship as Leeds did for coming 17th. And this is the worry that Formula 1 is going to try and consolidate all of that money so that teams only end up getting richer and richer and richer and richer. And the same thing is going to happen with the Concorde agreement. The bigger teams like Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, they're going to say no to certain things because they want to keep things contained, they want to keep more money for themselves, they want to be able to spend more, and so on and so on and so on. While Williams, AlphaTauri, or whatever they're called this week, and Haas will say no to certain things because they want to get a leg up and they want to bring things closer together because they don't have the money. And this happens every single time that the Concorde agreement comes up for renewal. It just does. It's been happening for the last 40 years. But in the week of the Monaco Grand Prix, so last weekend, Toto Wolff and Christian Horner were being interviewed and they both said that they're quite happy with the way things are going. So it is what it is, I guess, and that's becoming the new phrase on this channel, isn't it? But for fans, it can be a bit worrying. 99.997% of fans would rather see another team on the grid. A good chunk of those fans are probably seeing all this as an excuse to not have Andretti anywhere near Formula 1, but with the court cases being filed in the US, that might make an impact. But I'm all court cased out for a bit. A lot of fans are going to see this as a money-making exercise for the sport and the teams at the detriment to the actual sport, or detriment of the actual sport. Anyway, this from the same sport that wants to grow an American market without an American team that wants to be there as well. However, talks are apparently in place between Formula 1 and Andretti to bring in this thing that will allow Andretti to come in and compete, with the most recent ones taking place at the Miami Grand Prix, and this might see Andretti make the grid in 2026 after all, with a customer engine before General Motors is ready to run their own engine. $1 billion valuations for teams means that anybody wanting to come in will have to fork out an absolutely absurd amount of money to buy out an existing franchise, if we're going to call it that. While teams like Manor and HRT were worthless, their spot on the grid was worth a lot. It all seems right now with what they're proposing that they're going to contain all the money within the 10 teams, push the values up to stratospheric levels, and then that will mean that nobody else in their right mind will buy in. Unless pre-approved anyway. They're saying they don't want to do the whole divide and conquer thing that Bernie was doing, but are they just dividing the fans away from the teams and only conquering their own bank accounts? That line sounded a lot cleverer in my head, but when the Netflix bubble really does go pop and people just go, hey, I'm not watching this anymore because now I'm seeing Formula 1 for what it really is, where are they going to get their next lot of interest from? So then this has been a thing happening in the world of Formula 1, and this has been my opinions on that thing. If this thing has made you think things about the thing, then like this thing so I know I've done a good job. And for more things from this channel, hit the subscribe button thing and ring the bell thing so you never miss out on anything that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon that continue to support the channel at a more personal level. And if you want to help chip in with things around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. As well as there being a link to the F1 store where if you buy stuff, I get a kickback. There's some stuff that's just been uploaded if you're interested. Other super thanks and memberships if those are more your thing. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.